Former New York Congressman Vito Fossella joins us now in our Moneynews studio. Welcome, Vito.
Thank you, Ashley. Good to be here.
First, let's take up the debt ceiling and raising it, or not so. House Speaker John Boehner says Obama is sorely mistaken if he expects the House to support tax increases as part of a deal to raise the debt limit. Now, apparently Obama was referring to so-called tax loopholes. Where do you see this whole tax breaks for the wealthy thing playing out in the end?
Well, I think overall it's healthy that the country is finally, and Washington, the administration and Congress is finally focusing on the debt issues that are really hampering our economy, both short and particularly over the long term. And I do think that on balance, the House and Speaker Boehner are on the right side here in terms of addressing it once and for all and not continually kicking the can down the road. I think ultimately what you'll probably see is some short-term compromise, and the Congress and the administration will revisit it in a number of months. Obviously, August 2nd has been driven down into the consciousness as the drop-dead date, so to speak. So I wouldn't be surprised if the next couple of weeks there's at least a short-term compromise reached. And overall, I think, I think the president would be on the right side of history if he embraces tax reform but tax reform that broadens the tax base and is rooted in economic growth, as opposed to just punishing those who have been successful, entrepreneurs or folks who have not just started but have operated their own business and been successful. That's sort of the wrong approach, and I think the wrong view, and frankly short-sighted, because ultimately when you punish the entrepreneurial spirit in this country, over the long haul you only serve to reduce jobs, and the last thing this country needs right now is something that will punish job creation.
On the Senate side, Jim DeMint tells us he would never even consider raising the debt limit without 1, spending cuts, 2, spending caps, and 3, a constitutional balanced budget amendment. Does that sound too harsh, or do you think Senator DeMint's spot on with that?
Well, I think Senator DeMint has been a champion of fiscal sanity and fiscal responsibility in Washington since his days in the House and now in the Senate. So I think you always sort of defer to his approach. The question is, can you get something like a balanced budget amendment passed in addition to capping and capping spending and, if you will, reining it in? Which is essential. Now, this time last year, a year ago, the conversation was about reining in spending. So look at how much progress we've made in the last year, and we actually have the administration sort of at the table recognizing and acknowledging that spending needs to be reined in. So while that may be a good principled approach, I think when all is said and done, what you need is to have a compromise that will address the short-term issues of spending and put in place mechanisms that address this fiscal issue once and for all. Because what's harboring, in this sort of tempest is this uncertainty that's plaguing our economy. When you really boil it down, the debt ceiling is one aspect, the regulatory impediments that are hampering the financial sector and the healthcare sector. You have issues in Europe, Greece and the Eurozone, uncertainty there. You have an unwillingness by many to address the long-term financial situation of the United States. You have business folks and consumers who are uncertain whether they should allocate and deploy capital. So this is part of that package. And unless I think we all address that, we're going to continue to see economic growth lag where it should be, which again gets back to what's the number one issue: having growth-oriented policies that create new jobs.
Early in the year, Representative Michelle Bachmann introduced legislation to repeal the Dodd-Frank financial reform bill. If you were still in the House right now, would you be behind that?
I would, and in part, it's not just fiscal and monetary policy that stifle economic growth. It's a regulatory wet blanket that sits over the financial sector, and indirectly, every small business in this country or large business deals with a financial institution in some way, shape, or form. So with the uncertainty as to what the regulatory environment would be, don't forget, by this time, there should have been more regulations in place. That decision has been kicked down the road, so once again we've injected uncertainty in the economy, and I thought it was an overreach. I think when it comes to regulation, we need regulation that's more sensible, more smart, that reflects our economy and our financial institutions to date and the economy as a whole. But just to throw everything at the problem and say it's gonna be the cure-all, I think history has taught us that's a mistake, and I think we're sort of seeing that as a result of the implementation, particularly in the regulations of Dodd-Frank.
The nation's unemployment rate is still over 9%. That doesn't include the people who have simply given up looking for work or those who are doing little odd jobs, underemployed. In Business Week, writing in Bloomberg Business Week, Chris Farrell says the real fiscal crisis is joblessness. Is he correct about that?
I agree, and the question is, what's the role of government in all of this? And now I think we have the ability of hindsight to look back over the last few years at the policies that have been put in place. Don't forget, these policies were put in place to address joblessness and the unemployment rate. There were predictions made that unemployment would drop below 8% if you agreed to the stimulus package, if you agree to Dodd-Frank, if you agree to Obamacare, if you agree to all that. Well, guess what? It hasn't happened. So now I think what we have is an obligation and responsibility to be undoing that, because I do think there is a moral obligation on the role of government to create an environment in which economic growth can happen. The policies that are put in place have not worked. I think you need growth-oriented policies to put people back to work. More than half of those people who are considered unemployed, forget those who stopped looking, have been out of work longer than 6 months. So now we're getting on a chronic and sustained unemployment, people who want to take care of themselves, who want to be independent, who want to take care of their families. And frankly, the economic climate that's been created has prevented that from happening.
Finally, turning to the debt crisis in Greece, does that impact the United States in any way?
I think we have to be very sensitive to what happens in Greece in many ways. In a simple sort of way, if Greece continues to be plagued by the financial burdens that it's under, and it looks like it will be, then the Eurozone will be sort of put in crisis. And then secondarily, what happens to countries like Portugal and Ireland and others that may be, or Spain for that matter, and may be in a similar predicament? And then what does that do to our interrelations with the European economy, not to mention the global economy as a whole? So Greece, I think, is sort of the canary in the coal mine as to what's happening when countries spend too much and don't focus on the things that truly matter from an economic point of view. And to a degree, the U.S., while not necessarily in Greece's position, is still running a tab that is, for example, federal outlays are about 25% of our gross domestic product. That's higher than it needs to be. Again, we have not addressed the long-term financial obligations this country has had. We have not addressed the debt issues whatsoever, or in a sufficient way. We have not addressed, as you point out, the joblessness issues. And we have not created a climate where economic growth should be where it needs to reignite the jobs market. For 150 years, on average, growth has been about 3%. We are still significantly less than that from when this first economic sort of dip took place several years ago. We need to accelerate economic growth, and Greece is an example of what could happen if we let a situation linger far too long.
Former New York City Congressman Vito Fossella, thanks so much. Always a pleasure, sir. Thanks.
Thank you, Ashley.
And thanks for watching Money News.